Our presentation is on Chapter 6 in Being Gifted in School. The chapter is titled Creativity: Psychology, Development, and Teaching. According to the textbook, there is no single definition of creativity. The authors are able to provide a definition of creativity, and they define it as a general process that is expressed in many aspects of life and is exhibited in increasingly more specific ways as age increases. Some main points to this slide are that the definition of creativity should be relevant to our topic of being gifted in schools, consistent with the state of our knowledge, and helpful in discussing the questions of measurement, process, and education. And creativity should allow for rationality, intuition, personality, and motivation in the creative process. As children are younger, they are typically more generally creative, and as they age, they tend to be creative in more field-specific ways. In keeping with the definition or lack of universal definition of creativity, Gowan proposed that definitions of creativity be organized on a continuum from rational or conscious to irrational or unconscious. And in 1980, Busey and Manfield classified notions of creativity in terms of how to correspond to 7 theoretical traditions in psychology. This theory shows how particular elements of the creative process are better represented in one theory and not another, and how some theories align themselves better with one domain than another. The 7 theoretical traditions in the Busey and Manfield definition are the psychoanalytic category, which says that unconscious thought equals new perspective, the Gestalt category, which is restructuring elements, the association category, which says that the creative person has to access ideas which exist in hierarchical relation to each other. The perceptual category is an openness to different perspectives. The humanistic category is uniqueness of the individual and their environment. The cognitive development category states that creativity is an irreversible process where creative solutions seem obvious. And the composite category really just unites all of the 6 categories, or many of the 6 categories, into one theory or definition. In 1996, Csikszentmihalyi came up with 2 types of creativity, the big C and the little c. The big C is the type of creativity which makes one famous. So those famous creators who changed the world. Where the little c is when one changes their own lives or experiences in the world in a new and original manner. So that's really the difference, is the people who are changing the world, changing others, versus the people who are changing themselves and their own experiences. In 1998, Mumford offered 2 divisions of creativity, and those are quite contrasting. So creativity is an unconscious, uncontrollable phenomenon versus creativity is an active manipulation of available information using mechanisms such as analogical reasoning. And you can clearly see the part played by irrational and rational consciousness in these 2 examples of creativity. The 4 basic questions which we will be addressing in this chapter are: what does creativity look like? And we'll be looking at measurement practices. We will be answering what is the relationship between intelligence and creativity. We will discuss what is happening when creativity is occurring, that is the process, and what conditions are conducive to enhancing creativity. And what does that look like in our classrooms? Just like any good test or measurement, the measurement techniques that we use to identify creative children also need to meet the same standards of reliability, validity, and selection of norm groups. There are 3 different categories for testing creativity. The first is standardized tests, and there are a couple of examples in the chapter. And standardized tests measure fluency, the number of answers they correctly were able to answer, originality compared to the norm group's response, elaboration, how much detail did they include in the response, and flexibility, so the number of categories among the responses. The Torrance test of creative thinking measures fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. Another type of standardized test is the Wallach-Kogan test, and that is less related to IQ than the Torrance tests of creative thinking. It also has verbal and visual components, and the responses may become less typical as the test progresses. Another measurement of creativity would be rating scales and checklists. And we've talked a bit about rating scales and checklists in the past, so these would simply relate to creativity. A group inventory for finding talent measures interest in art, flexibility, and independence. And the third category for measuring creativity is work samples. And work samples are basically products of creativity. And one of the big things that was mentioned in the textbook is that there would need to be expert judges on these work samples, someone who really understands how this measurement can be used. The following are Torrance's 18 creative characteristics, and I'll quickly read through those. The first is the ability to express feelings and emotions, then the ability to improvise, thirdly, articulateness in role-playing, enjoyment and ability in visual arts, enjoyment and ability in creative movement, enjoyment and ability in music, use of expressive speech, fluency and flexibility in figural media, enjoyment and skills in group activities, responsiveness to the concrete, responsiveness to the kinesthetic, expressiveness of gestures, humor, richness of imagery in informal language, originality of ideas in problem solving, problem-centered or persistence in problem solving, emotional responsiveness, and quickness of warm-up. When we assess creativity and when we have that expert who can judge those samples, those products, they're typically looking for unusualness, which is novelty and surprise, something that is not typical. They're looking for appropriateness. It fits the situation to perfection, whatever that situation may be. Transformation. So is this sample breaking new ground and stimulating new work? And also condensation. Is it simple yet powerful? It seems that studies which try to prove a correlation between creativity and intelligence are not consistent. Some of the studies find that there is a correlation. Some of them find a low positive correlation, or maybe even a moderate positive correlation, but others cannot prove a correlation. So Hollingworth concluded that creativity is not synonymous with intelligence. However, motivation, schooling, and family are strongly related to creative performance. And Guilford concluded that the existence of a low to moderate positive correlation between IQ and creativity exists, suggesting that creativity is relatively independent from intelligence, but that there may be a small correlation. So the big question is creativity the same thing as intelligence? And do measures of intelligence measure the same thing as measures of creativity? There are a couple of types of tests to measure IQ versus creativity, such as divergent thinking tests. And it appears that one who is highly creative also is fairly highly intelligent. So there seems to be some correlation between being highly creative and also having a higher IQ, aside from those with an extremely high IQ. However, students with a high IQ are not necessarily highly creative. Krockenberg states that there might be a threshold above which there is little relationship between IQ and creativity. Well, Albert states that the interrelationship is twofold. Creative performance requires intelligence for processing information and problems, and gifted intelligence is associated generally with a number of the same personality characteristics associated with creative ability. And lastly, Sternberg states that creativity tends to be rather but not totally distant from psychometrically measured intelligence. There are several models for the creative process. First is the Wallace model, and I'll discuss that in more details following this slide. Next is the investment model, and that states that you increase creativity with 6 resources. Basically, the investment model is that one would produce ideas that have little value, so they would buy low, which would be a good investment, and then eventually convince others of the merit of those ideas, so they would sell their ideas high. The next is the propulsion model of creative contributions, and that has switched the attention from the person to the creative product. The next 2 slides are about the Wallace model. And the first stage of the Wallace model is the preparation stage, and that is the time when the person develops skill, knowledge, and attitudes that are useful for creative activity. Unfortunately, in our schools, we offer the least amount of time for creative activities. I think that's something that schools are working on, and we'll see that later in this slideshow. The good news is that when creative-like behavior is rewarded, children display it more often. So if a curriculum is set up with more freedom and can allow more problem solving to help creativity develop, then students should be learning and increasing creativity. The next stage is the incubation stage, and this stage is invisible because it is when previous sustained work is set aside and not solved. So they've come up with this problem in their preparation stage, but really are pushing it to the backs of their minds and not sitting and thinking about it. They take a step back from the problem, let their minds contemplate, and kind of work through it on and off, sometimes setting it aside for a year or multiple years, not typically students, but adults and other people who are trying to solve a problem. So it could last only a few minutes for a student, maybe a week, a couple of days, but as people age, they tend to take even longer in this incubation stage. Turning inward is a way to work through this incubation stage through hypnosis, meditation, relaxation, and it allows people to put their own thoughts to the side. Just allowing them to think inwardly. And then forcing association, such as brainstorming, is something we typically do in schools, and it helps creative minds think and work through problems without judgment. So we don't feel like we need to make that decision right now and have the answer. A brainstorm allows them to put any ideas on paper, any problem-solving ideas they may have, and really talk and work through those ideas. So we may find that more creative ways to solve the problem will come up through brainstorms because they're really putting anything out there free of judgment. And so it typically generates more ideas when one can individually brainstorm and just put their own ideas on paper. However, often in schools we do group brainstorms and individual. The illumination stage is where people have made progress and they believe that success is ahead. It's where the person has figured out the problem and how to solve the problem, and then moves on to the verification stage, which is where the creative product is evaluated and revised until the creator believes it is ready to show others.